Tonight, we enter the story of Troy not as a legend of war, but as a living city of warm stone, sea breeze, and quiet routines. This is not the tale of a wooden horse or burning towers, but of mothers braiding their children's hair at dawn, potters shaping bowls for tomorrow's meal, and elders watching the horizon with no sense that everything they knew would soon be gone. You are not here to witness an ending, but to walk gently through a world that once believed it had time, and to remember how deeply human history truly is. Close your eyes now, if it brings you comfort. Let your breath slow, not because you are told to, but because your body already knows how to return to stillness when the world speaks in whispers. Imagine standing on the western ramparts of Troy at dusk. The air carries the scent of crushed thyme, the salt temps of the Hellespont below, and the faint smoke of evening fires rising from courtyards packed tightly within the walls. Far out on the water, the sea glows bronze in the last light. Closer, a child calls for their dog. Somewhere inside the citadel, a weaver's spindle turns in the dimness of a room lit only by oil flame. This is the Troy we will visit tonight, not the myth, but the living city beneath it. For centuries before the first Greek ship ever appeared on the horizon, Troy thrived as a crossroads of worlds. It sat at the narrow strait between two seas, where traders from Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and the Balkans met to exchange copper, olive oil, textiles, and stories. Its people built homes with shared courtyards, planted orchards that fed generations, honored gods whose names are now half-lost gods of the hearth. The harvest, the river that curled like a silver thread through the plain. They spoke a language related to the Hittites. War robes dyed with madder root, and marked the passage of time not with battles, but with festivals, births, and the slow turning of the seasons. They had no reason to believe their world would end. And like all of us, they lived as if tomorrow would be much like today. Archaeologists have uncovered at least 9 cities stacked one upon another on the hill of Hisarlikich, rising from the ruins of the one before, like layers of memory in the earth. The Troy that faced the Greek siege was likely the 7th of these. A compact, resilient place with narrow lanes, thick walls, and storerooms filled with grain enough to last a winter. Its people were not soldiers by trade, but farmers, weavers, priests, and parents. They did not wake each morning thinking of Helen or destiny. They woke to feed their animals, to grind grain, to check the roof for leaks after rain. And it is this daily humanity, the texture of their lives, the weight of their quiet joys and worries that we will follow tonight. Not the thunder of war, but the soft rhythm of a world that once was. Now, if you've ever seen that movie with Brad Pitt as Achilles Sweaty, golden and dramatically shirtless on a beach, you might have a very particular image of Troy in your mind. Orlando Bloom, wide-eyed on the ramparts, shouting "Father," like the whole city could hear him over the wind. Well, let's just say the real Troy was far less concerned with perfect hair and heroic slow-motion runs, and far more with making sure the lentils didn't burn and the goats stayed inside the pen. But we love that movie anyway because it made us care. And maybe that's how you found your way here tonight? If this kind of storytelling brings you peace, if it helps you rest, if it makes the past feel close, and can gently invite you to subscribe. Not for alerts or urgency, but so this space remains here for you, always, like a lantern left burning on a quiet shore. And if you'd like, you can share in the comments where, in time or space, you're listening from: a rainy night in Tokyo, a quiet room in Lisbon, a cabin in the mountains, or a city that never sleeps. Your presence, even as you drift towards sleep, is part of this story now. Now, let the sound of the waves replace the noise of your day. Let the wind off the Dardanelles carry away the weight you've been holding. Somewhere beyond the edge of your thoughts, the gates of Troy stand open. Smoke rises from 100 hearths. A lyre plays softly in an upper room, and the city waits not for its end, but for dreamers like you, who come not to witness destruction, but to remember how it once felt to be alive within its walls. In the long years before the first sail ever darkened the horizon of the Hellespont, Troy existed in a kind of golden ordinary city, not waiting for destiny, but simply living within the generous rhythm of sun, sea, and soil. Its walls, high and weathered by centuries of wind and rain, were not built for war, but for the quiet assurance of shelter. They enclosed not a fortress, but a home where generations had been born. Loved, argued, cooked, mourned, and dreamed beneath the same patch of sky. Inside those walls, life unfolded with the unhurried grace of olive branches swaying in the afternoon breeze. Each day, much like the one before, and no one minded, because sameness was not boredom, but safety, and safety was the deepest form of peace. Mornings began not with bells or proclamations, but with the soft clink of clay jars as women walked barefoot down the narrow lanes toward the shared cistern near the western gate, their robes brushing against sun-warmed stone, their voices low and melodic as they greeted neighbors already sweeping dust from their thresholds. The air carried the mingled scents of baking barley bread, damp earth from last night's rain, and the faint sweetness of wild thyme crushed underfoot. Children, still drowsy-eyed, trailed behind their mothers or chased half-tamed chickens through courtyards where laundry hung like banners of faded red and ochre, fluttering gently in the salt-laced wind that always came from the sea. There was no rush, no sense of time slipping away, only the slow, steady turning of another day in a world that believed it would last. Homes in Troy were built around open courtyards, spaces where light and air could move freely, where families gathered to eat, to spin wool, to tell stories as dusk fell. Walls were thick, made of mud brick and timber, plastered smooth and sometimes painted with simple bands of red or white ochre. Not for beauty alone, but to keep the heat out in summer and the cold at bay in winter. Roofs were flat or gently sloped, layered with reeds and clay, and in the warm months, families often slept there beneath a sky so clear it felt like you could reach up and gather stars in your hands. Inside, rooms were small and dim, lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps whose flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on shelves holding everyday treasures, a well-worn grinding stone, a child's clay rattle, a small figurine of a goddess with wide hips and gentle eyes, placed near the hearth for protection. The marketplace near the lower gate was the city's pulse, not loud or chaotic, but alive with the steady hum of exchange. Merchants from Lesbos arrived with amphorae of olive oil sealed with pine resin. Traders from the Anatolian highlands brought copper ingots wrapped in wool, sacks of dried figs, and bundles of fragrant cedar wood. In the shade of a linen awning, a weaver unrolled a bolt of fabric dyed deep red with madder root, while a potter displayed bowls whose rims were smoothed by generations of use. No one shouted prices. Bargaining was done with nods, with shared sips of watered wine, with the easy familiarity of people who had traded with each other's families for decades. Trust was not written in contracts, but woven into the fabric of daily interaction, into the way a seller remembered your daughter's name, or added an extra fig for the road. Food was the quiet poetry of Troy's days. Barley was ground each morning on stone querns, the rhythmic scrape a familiar sound in every household, and the coarse flour was mixed with water and a pinch of salt to make flat breads, baked on hot stones or in clay ovens. Lentils simmered all afternoon in earthenware pots with onions, wild garlic, and herbs gathered from the hillsides. In season, tables held olives cured in brine, grapes heavy with juice, pomegranates split open like jewels, and figs so ripe they bled sweetness onto the fingers. Wine was always watered, never drunk alone, and a guest was never offered just bread. They were given bread, salt, and a cup. Because to share a meal was to say, you belong here, even if only for a moment. Children learned not in schools, but through the patient rhythm of imitation. Boys followed their fathers to the fields beyond the lower town, where they learned to guide oxen, mend fences, or cast nets into the shallows of the Scamander River. Girls stayed close to their mothers, learning to card wool, spin thread, weave on upright looms, and stir pots without burning the stew. There were no lessons in glory or conquest, only in how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip, how to tell when the olives were ready to press, how to soothe a crying baby with a lullaby passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter. Knowledge was not stored in books, but in hands, in voices, in the quiet certainty that what you needed to know would be given to you when the time came. Religion in Troy was not a separate sphere of life, but its very breath. Every home held a small shrine near the hearth, a niche in the wall, where a pinch of grain, a drop of oil, or a honey cake might be left each morning for the household gods. The great temple on the citadel, perhaps dedicated to a storm god like Tarhana, or a protective goddess like Istar. was visited on festival days, but most prayers were whispered in kitchens, at wells, or under the shade of an ancient olive tree. People did not worship to be saved from eternity, but to be held through the day, to ask for rain, for healthy children, for a safe return from a journey. The gods were not distant rulers, but neighbors who watched from the hills, the stars, and the rustle of leaves. The river Scamander curled through the plain like a silver thread, its banks lined with reeds, willows, and wildflowers that bloomed in bursts of purple and gold. Women came here at midday to wash clothes, beating them against smooth stones, their laughter rising with the steam from the warm shallows. Fishermen pulled small boats through the reeds, casting nets with movements so practiced they seemed part of the river's own flow. In summer, children swam in the deeper pools, their brown limbs flashing in the sunlight, their shouts echoing off the water. The river was not owned, it was shared, like the air, like the sun. It gave clay for pottery, fish for supper, and cool mud to soothe tired feet after a long day in the fields. Evenings in Troy were long and soft, unfolding like a well-worn blanket. As the sun dipped behind Mount Ida, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, families gathered in their courtyards to share the day's meal. Someone might tell a story not of heroes or monsters, but of a clever fox that stole a chicken and got away, or the time the well ran dry and the whole neighborhood dug a new one together, passing buckets hand to hand until water finally bubbled up from the earth. The stars came out slowly, one by one, until the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a path of spilled milk. And no one feared the dark, it was simply the world resting, as all living things must. There were no soldiers in Troy, then only men who knew how to use a spear to hunt boar in the hills, or a bow to scare off wolves that prowled near the flocks. The city walls, though high, had stood so long without threat that children played on them, tracing their fingers over the grooves left by masons centuries before. Watchtowers were used more to spot incoming traders than enemies, and when a ship appeared on the horizon, first thought was never invasion, but news, goods, or a traveler with stories from across the sea. The sea was a friend, not a threat, a highway of connection, not a mote of fear. Time in Troy was not measured in years, but in harvests. The barley harvest in spring, the grape harvest in late summer. The olive harvest in autumn, when the air filled with the sharp green scent of crushing fruit. Elders measured their lives not in birthdays, but in grandchildren, how many had walked, how many had spoken their first words. A young couple's future was not planned in decades, but in seasons. We'll plant the orchard next spring. The baby will walk by the fig harvest. There was no sense of history unfolding, only life, continuing like a river flowing toward the sea without knowing its own name. No one in Troy that year dreamed they would be remembered. They did not carve their names into stone or commission songs about themselves. Their legacy was not meant for strangers thousands of years later. It was meant for the next person who would grind grain in that same courtyard, who would hum the same lullaby, who would look up at the same stars and feel, for a moment, that all was well. They lived for the warmth of a shared blanket on a cool night, for the taste of fresh bread dipped in olive oil, for the sound of their child's voice calling them home from the street. These were not small things, they were everything. And so, in this quiet world where the greatest drama might be a lost goat, a delayed harvest, or a pot that cracked in the fire Troy breathed, it did not know it stood on the edge of legend. It only knew how to live, fully and gently, in the light it was given. Perhaps that is the most sacred thing of all. To live without knowing you are being watched by time. To love without knowing your love will echo through centuries. To build a home without knowing it will become a memory. In those final years before the ships appeared, Troy was not a symbol, not a warning, not a lesson. It was simply a city where people woke each morning to the same sun, loved the same people, and hoped, as all humans do, that tomorrow would be much like today. And for a while, it was. For a while, it was enough. Far to the west, beyond the curving coastline of Anatolia and across the sea that ancient mariners called Windark, it's not for its color alone, but for the way it deepened into mystery at dusk. Another world breathed in the quiet certainty of its own rhythms, a land of sun-baked stone, its disciplined silence, and olive trees so gnarled by time their branches seemed to hold the memories of generations in their twisted limbs. Sparta, unlike the bustling ports of the Aegean, or the cedar-scented courtyards of Troy, carried its strength in stillness. In the way its men moved with the economy of wolves. In the way its women held their gaze steady, as if they had long ago decided that vulnerability was a luxury they could not afford. And in the unspoken understanding that every gesture, every word, every breath was part of a larger order that must not be disturbed. It was into this world of measured steps and unspoken codes that a young man from the East would arrive, not as a conqueror, not as a figure of destiny, but simply as a guest trapped in the sacred. It's an unbreakable bond of Xenia, the ancient law that said a stranger at your door must be fed, sheltered, and honored before even their name is asked. Because any traveler might be a god in disguise, and to fail in hospitality was to invite ruin not just upon yourself, but upon your children's children for generations to come. His name was Paris, though in the narrow alleys of his home city he was more often called Alexandrassa, name that meant defender of men, though he had never felt much like a defender of anyone, least of all himself. He was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, yes, but not the heir. That mantle belonged to his brother Hector, whose presence alone seemed to steady the walls of Troy, whose voice carried the calm authority of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. Paris, by contrast, had been born under a shadow, a dream his mother had before his birth, in which she gave birth to a torch that set the city ablaze, and so, fearing the prophecy, his parents had sent him away as an infant to be raised among shepherds on the slopes of Mount Ida. Far from the palace, far from the weight of royal blood, far from the eyes that might see him as a threat, there, among the flocks and the wind and the slow turning of the seasons, he learned to read the sky for rain, to soothe the lamb with his voice, to find peace in solitude, and to speak the quiet language of animals and trees. When he was brought back to Troy as a young man after, proving his royal blood in a contest of arms he never wanted to enter, he returned not as a prince, restored, but as a stranger in his own home, always watching from the edges of feasts and councils, always listening more than speaking, always feeling the quiet distance between himself and the destiny that seemed written for everyone else but him. The journey to Sparta had not been his idea, not truly. It had begun as a diplomatic gesture. Menelaus, king of Sparta, had sent word that he wished to strengthen ties with Troy, to open trade routes for tin and cedar, to exchange envoys as a sign of mutual respect in a world where trust was as fragile as a clay cup dropped on stone. The elders of Troy debated who should go, someone wise, someone steady, in Paris, sensing an opening, a chance to breathe air that did not carry the scent of his father's disappointment or his brother's quiet pity, volunteered. Not with fanfare, not with bold declarations, but with a simple sentence spoken softly in council: "I will go." And because no one could think of a reason to refuse, because he was royal, because he spoke Greek well enough, because the gods had not sent a sign against it, they agreed. So he packed a chest with gifts. Bolts of Anatolian wool dyed the deep red of pomegranate rind, silver cups inlaid with lapis lazuli, cedar wood carved into the shape of birds in flight, and a small ivory box filled with myrrh resin, the kind burned in temples to carry prayers upward on fragrant smoke. The ship that carried him was not a war vessel, but a merchant's galley. Low and broad, its hull stained with salt and age, its sails patched in places with cloth from a dozen ports. The crew were not soldiers but sailors who knew the moods of the sea as intimately as they knew their own wives. Handsmen who could read the color of the water, the direction of the gulls, the tension in the wind long before a storm broke. Days passed in the gentle rhythm of oars dipping and rising, of sails filling and slackening, nights spent under a sky so vast it made the heart ache with both loneliness and wonder. Paris often stood at the prow, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the evening chill, watching the horizon blur into blue, wondering what kind of man Menelaus would be, stern like the stories said, or kinder beneath the surface. Would the Spartans see him as a prince, or as an outsider? And beneath those questions, quieter still, another: will I finally feel like I belong somewhere? The sea offered no answers, only the endless murmur of waves against wood, a sound so constant it began to feel like the earth's own breath. When the ship finally neared the coast of Laconia, the air changed drier, sharper, scented with wild sage, thyme, and the dust kicked up by Spartan sandals on stone. The landscape was spare, almost severe, hills of pale rock, olive groves gnarled by time, and in the distance, the walls of the city rising like a promise of order in a chaotic world. He was met not with fanfare, but with quiet efficiency, a steward in a plain tunic, like a cart drawn by two sturdy mules, a path through groves where the light fell in dappled patterns on the ground. The palace of Menelaus was not grand in the way of Eastern kings, with gold and towering columns, but strong in its simplicity. Thick walls of limestone, courtyards open to the sky, floors polished smooth by generations of footsteps. Wealth here was not displayed, but implied in the weight of the bronze door hinges, in the evenness of the masonry. In the silence that followed a well-spoken word, as if every sound had been weighed and found worthy. And then, in the late afternoon of his second day, he saw her. She was not standing on a balcony like a statue, not draped in jewels like a queen in a poem, but sitting in the courtyard near a shallow pool where lilies floated on the surface, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a clay cup, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the walls, perhaps the mountains, perhaps the past, perhaps nothing at all. Her beauty was real, yes, but it was not what struck him first. It was her stillness, the way she seemed to carry a quiet world within her that no one else could enter. She looked up as he approached, not with surprise, but with a kind of weary recognition, as if she had been expecting someone, though not necessarily him. They spoke of small things, at first of the sea crossing, of the strange birds that nested in the eaves of the palace, of the way the light in Sparta was harder, brighter, than in the east, but, beneath the surface of those words, something else passed between them, a recognition, not of destiny, but of shared solitude. In Troy, Paris was the son who didn't fit. In Sparta, Helen was the queen who was never asked what she wanted. Menelaus, for his part, was a generous host, as all men of that time were bound to be by the laws of Xenia, the sacred bond between guest and host that was older than kings and stronger than oaths. He offered wine, bread, a place at his table, and the promise of safe passage home. He spoke of trade, of mutual respect, of the importance of peace between their lands. He did not suspect, could not suspect, that the greatest threat to his world would not come with a sword, but with a glance exchanged in the golden light of late afternoon, when the shadows grew long and the air softened into something almost tender. He trusted, as all hosts must, and in that trust lay both his nobility and his vulnerability. He left his home, his wife, his guest, in the care of the gods and the customs of his people, never imagining that the very law that protected him would become the path through which everything he loved would slip away. Evenings in Sparta were quiet, filled with the murmur of conversation and the occasional strum of a lyre. Paris was given a room with a view of the Taygetus Mountains, and from his window he could see the stars emerge one by one, cold and distant. He thought of Troy, of his father Priam, old and weary, of his brother Hector, steady as a stone wall, of the narrow streets where he had played as a boy. He wondered if he would ever feel at home there again. And then he thought of Helena, of the way she had laughed softly at something he said, of the way her robe caught the light like water. It was not passion that moved him, not yet, but something quieter, the feeling of being understood, perhaps for the first time. In her eyes he was not the prince who didn't belong, not the boy sent away to die, but simply a man seen, heard, known. Helen, too, was caught in a current she did not name. Life in Sparta was one of comfort, yes, but also of performance. Every gesture watched, every word weighed. She had been taken from her first home as a girl, carried off by Theseus in a story no one liked to tell anymore, and later claimed by Menelaus in a marriage arranged by kings and oaths sworn over wine and fire. She had learned to smile when expected, to speak when spoken to be the jewel in Sparta's crown. But in Paris, she saw something rare, a man who looked at her not as a prize, but as a person. And in that look, a door opened, just a crack but enough to let in the whisper of another life. One where she might choose her own path, where her name might mean something more than the face that launched 1,000 ships. No one planned what came next. There were no secret meetings in the dead of night, no coded messages, no grand declarations. Only a slow unfolding like a flower opening to the sun. A shared walk through the olive grove at dawn, when the air was cool and the birds had not yet begun to sing. A conversation that lasted longer than it should have, stretching into the quiet hours when the rest of the palace slept. A moment of silence that said more than words ever could. And then one evening when Menelaus was called away to Crete for a family Matara death in the royal line, a duty he could not refuse, he left his home in the care of his guest, as custom demanded. It was not betrayal in the way we think of it now, but a collision of human longing and ancient law, of heart and obligation, played out in the quiet spaces between words, where the most important choices are often made without a single spoken sentence. When the time came to leave, the decision was made not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones. Paris did not steal Helen away like a thief in the night, walked with him not because she was taken, but because she chose to, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of weariness, perhaps simply because the path ahead seemed less heavy than the one behind. They boarded the ship not as fugitives but as travelers, carrying with them not gold or weapons, but the fragile weight of a choice that would ripple outward in ways they could never imagine. The sails caught the wind, and the coast of Sparta faded into the distance, not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a door closing on a life that could never be reclaimed. Back in Troy, no one knew yet. The city breathed as it always had. Children played in the courtyards, potters shaped their clay, weavers hummed their songs. The walls stood tall, the river flowed, the stars turned. But somewhere on the sea, a ship carried more than passengers. It carried the first whisper of a new path, one that would lead not to peace, but to a reckoning. And yet in that moment, there was no thunder, no omen in the sky, no voice from the gods. Only two people adrift in the vastness of their own hearts, believing they were choosing freedom, not fate. The gods, of course, would later be blamed Aphrodite for promising Helen to Paris, in exchange for naming her the most beautiful Hera, and Athena for their wounded pride, Zeus for allowing it all to unfold. But in the human world, on the deck of that ship, there were no gods, only the salt wind, the creak of wood, and the silence between two people who had stepped off the edge of the known world and into something unknown. They did not speak much. There was no need. The sea stretched before them, endless and indifferent, and for a while, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, rumors would begin to drift like smoke on the wind, first in the ports of the Aegean, then in the marketplaces of Mycenae, then in the halls of kings who had sworn oaths long ago to protect Menelaus's honor. But in Troy, still nothing changed. The city lived on, unaware that its name was already being spoken in anger across the sea, that ships were being built, that oaths were being remembered. The whisper had begun, but the storm had not yet gathered. And so, in this fragile, in-between time after, the choice. Before the consequence, Roy remained a city of ordinary days, of bread and laughter and lamplight, where the greatest drama might be a lost goat or a pot that cracked in the fire, and where no one could yet hear the distant echo of oars striking water 1,000 miles away in the dark. It began not with a shout, not with a declaration, but with the soft creak of a ship's hull against the stone quay of Judeo in the deepest hour of a moonlit night, when the world seemed to hold its breath and even the waves lapped the shore with unusual gentleness, as if the sea itself understood that what was about to happen would echo far beyond this single moment. The air was cool and still, scented with salt and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine that climbed the garden walls of the palace, and the only light came from a single oil lamp swaying gently in the stern of the vessel, a small, trembling star against the vast darkness of the water. On the dock, two figures stood close, but not touching, their shadows long and blurred on the wet stone, their voices so low they might have been speaking to themselves, or to the wind, or to some unseen presence watching from the hills above. There was no plan, no grand strategy, no sense of history being made, only the quiet urgency of two people who had reached the edge of one life and could not imagine stepping back. Helen did not wear a crown that night, nor jewels, nor the fine robes of a Spartan queen. She was wrapped in a simple traveler's cloak of undyed wool, its hem damp with sea spray. Her hair loosely braided and tucked beneath a scarf, her feet bare inside soft leather sandals that had seen better days. She carried nothing but a small bundle tied with twine, perhaps a change of clothes, perhaps a keepsake, perhaps just the weight of everything she was leaving behind. In her hands, though steady, trembled slightly as she reached for the rope ladder that hung from the ship's side. She did not look back at the palace, not once, though its silhouette loomed dark and familiar against the star-strewn sky. She had already said her goodbyes in silence, in the way she had folded her sleeping daughter's blanket that afternoon, in the way she had lingered a moment too long by the hearth, memorizing the scent of wood smoke and olive oil. To leave was not an act of betrayal, but of survival, a choice made not in passion, but in the slow accumulation of days that felt like walls closing in, until the only door left was the one leading to the sea. Paris stood beside her, not as a hero, not as a thief, but as a man who had offered his hand, and now waited to see if she would take it. He had prepared the ship in secret, not with haste, but with the careful attention of someone who knew that one loose knot, one unsecured sail, could mean disaster. He had chosen a vessel small enough to go unnoticed, sturdy enough to weather the open sea. Crewed by men loyal not to kings or oaths, but to him, shepherds from Ida, merchants from the lower town, men who had shared bread with him when the palace turned its back. They did not speak as Helen boarded. They simply nodded, their faces shadowed by hoods, their movements quiet and efficient. There was no fanfare, no music, no omen in the sky, only the soft splash of oars dipping into the water, the sigh of the wind filling the sail, and the slow, inevitable glide of the ship away from the shore, as if the sea itself were drawing them into its embrace. Back in the palace, the rooms remained undisturbed. A cup of wine sat half-finished on a table. A spindle lay abandoned beside a half-woven thread. The bed was neatly made, as if no one had slept in it for days. Menelaus would not return for another week, called away to Crete by news of a kinsman's death, a duty he could not refuse, and by the time he did, the trail would be cold, the ship long gone, the choice already made. But in that moment, as the vessel slipped past the headlands and into the open water, no one knew what would come next. There was only the present, the cool night air on their faces, the rhythmic dip of the oars, the vast starlit expanse of the Aegean stretching before them like an unanswered question. They did not speak of love or destiny. They spoke of practical things, the wind direction, the next port. Whether the water skins were full, but beneath those words, something deeper passed between them, a shared understanding that they were no longer just individuals, but companions on a path that had no map. As the ship sailed east, the coast of Laconia faded into the darkness behind them, its mountains becoming silhouettes, then shadows, then nothing at all. The only sound was the creak of wood, the whisper of canvas, and the endless murmur of the sea, a sound so ancient it seemed to contain all the stories ever told and all the ones yet to be. Helen sat near the prow, her cloak pulled tight around her, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of dawn would eventually appear. She did not weep. She did not smile. She simply existed in the quiet space between two lives, neither here nor there, neither wife nor stranger, neither free nor lost. And in that in-between, she felt something she had almost forgotten, the sensation of possibility, fragile as a moth's wing, but real. Meanwhile, in the port of Gytheo, the first fisherman arrived at dawn, as he always did, and noticed the ship was gone, not unusual. But the rope had been cut, not untied, and the dock was unusually clean, as if swept. He mentioned it to the harbor master, who shrugged. Ships came and went, but by midday, a servant from the palace came, asking if anyone had seen the queen. Then another. Then a guard. Whispers began, not loud, not panicked, but curious, concerned, then uneasy. By evening, the truth had taken shape, not as a fact, but as a story. The guest had taken the host's wife. The sacred law of Xenia had been broken not by the host, but by the guest. And in a world where oaths were sworn over wine and fire, where honor was woven into the very fabric of society, such a breach was not just personal, it was cosmic. Those whispers did not stay in Sparta. They traveled on merchant ships, carried in the gossip of sailors over shared meals of barley and fish, passed between traders in the markets of Corinth and Mycenae, whispered in the courtyards of palaces where kings remembered the oath they had all sworn years ago at the wedding feast of Menelaus and Helenon, oath to defend his marriage, to come to his aid if ever it were threatened. That oath had seemed like a formality then, a ritual gesture among friends. Now it began to stir like a sleeping beast, its chains rattling in the dark. Messengers were sent, not with declarations of war, but with questions. Have you heard? Do you remember your vow? What will you do? And in every city, in every hall, the same silence followed the silence of men, who knew that to answer was to step onto a path with no return. But in Troy, none of this was known yet. The city slept beneath a sky full of stars, its walls standing tall against the night. Its streets quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the cry of a newborn. Inside the palace, Priam dreamed of his youth, of battles long past and children long grown. Hecuba stirred in her sleep, murmuring a lullaby she had sung to her youngest son decades ago. And in the lower town, a potter turned in his bed, dreaming of the bowl he would shape at dawn. The world was still whole, and the storm had not yet gathered, and the ship carrying two quiet souls across the wind-dark sea was just a speck on the water, invisible to all but the moon and the gods. When the vessel finally neared the Trojan coast, the first light of dawn was painting the sky in soft strokes of rose and gold, and the outline of the citadel appeared on the hill like a promise remembered from a dream. Smoke rose from 100 hearths. Goats bleated in the lower pastures. Fisherman cast his net into the shallows. To the people on the shore, it was just another ship returning from a journey, perhaps with goods, perhaps with news. They did not know that this one carried the seed of everything that was to come. They waved, as they always did, and went back to their work. Paris stood at the bow now, his hand resting on the rail, his heart beating not with fear, but with a strange, quiet hope. He had brought her here not to hide, but to offer her a home, not as a prize, but as a person. He knew his family would be wary, perhaps angry, perhaps afraid. But he also knew the soul of Troy. It was a city that honored guests, that valued compassion over pride, that had sheltered strangers for generations. He believed, perhaps naively, perhaps wisely, that they would choose mercy over judgment. And in that belief he took the final step. He guided the ship into the harbor, dropped anchor, and helped Helen onto the quay, where the dust of Troy rose softly around her feet like an old welcome. The first to see them was a washerwoman by the spring near the western gate. She did not cry out. She did not run. She simply paused, her hands still in the water, and watched as the two walked toward the city gates, their shadows long in the morning light. Then she turned to the woman beside her and said softly, "The prince has returned." And that was how it began, not with a trumpet, not with a scroll, but with a whisper passed between women at the well, a ripple moving outward through the fabric of daily life. Inside the walls, the news spread slowly, like water soaking into dry earth. A baker told his apprentice. A guard mentioned it to his brother. A child ran home shouting that Paris was back with a foreign woman. By midday, the palace knew. By evening, the whole city had heard. But there was no panic, no outrage, only curiosity, concern, and the quiet hum of a community trying to understand what this meant. Troy had always been a crossroads. Strangers came and went. But this was different. This was family. And family carried a different kind of weight. That night, as the stars came out and the city settled into its rhythm of lamplight and lullabies, no one spoke of war. They spoke of Helen's eyes, of the way she walked, of the silence that followed her like a shadow. They wondered where she had come from, what she had left behind, whether she would stay. And in every house, in every courtyard, the same unspoken question lingered in the air. What happens now? But no one had an answer. Not yet. For now, the ship sat at anchor in the harbor, its sails furled, its oars stilled. The sea was calm, the wind was gentle, and Troy, unaware of the storm gathering on the far side of the Aegean, breathed in the golden light of another ordinary day, its final day of true peace, though no one knew it. The first sail had come, the first choice had been made, and the world, ever so slowly, began to turn. Far across the sea, in the stone halls of Mycenae, where the walls were thick enough to muffle even the loudest grief, and the light fell in narrow, golden shafts through high windows that faced the mountains rather than the sea, a king sat alone with a scroll older than his beard, its edges softened by time and handling, its surface stained with wine, salt, and the faint smudge of a thumb that had traced the same names over and over, for decades, a list not of debts or taxes, but of oaths. Each one sealed with wax pressed by a different hand, each one bound by the sacred fire that had burned in the courtyard of Menelaus's palace on the day Helen was wed. When the air had been thick with the scent of roasting lamb, myrtle wreaths, and the low hum of 100 voices swearing loyalty not just to a man, but to the very idea of honor itself. Agamemnon, brother to Menelaus, did not rage when the news reached him through the lips of a breathless messenger who had ridden for 3 days without rest. He did not throw the scroll to the floor or call for his armor. He simply unrolled it slowly on the low table before him, his fingers brushing over names he had not thought of in years. Odysseus of Ithaca, whose mind was said to twist like a river through stone. Achilles of Phaeton, whose speed was matched only by his silence. Diomedes of Argos, who could throw a spear so true it seemed the wind itself carried it to its mark. Nestor of Pylos, whose voice still held the weight of 100 councils, and, as he read each name, he felt not the thrill of war, the heavy pull of a promise made in better times, now rising like a tide that could no longer be held back by silence or distance. And so he began to send messengers, not with threats or declarations, but with quiet reminders wrapped in olive branches and sealed with his own ring. Do you remember the feast? Do you remember the wine mixed with honey, the fire that burned all night? The vow you made when you took the cup from Menelaus's hand and said, "I will stand with you if ever your honor is broken"? And in every palace, from the sun-baked hills of the Peloponnese to the misty shores of Thessaly, kings looked at those messengers. Then at the scrolls they carried, then at the faces of their sons playing in the courtyards, and felt the slow, inevitable turning of a world that would no longer allow them to pretend. In Ithaca, where the cliffs rose like the spines of sleeping dragons and the sea crashed against the rocks with a rhythm as old as memory, Odysseus heard the messenger's words and did not answer at once. Instead, he walked down to his fields at dawn, as he always did, and began to plow not with oxen, but with a donkey and a bull yoked together, their steps uneven, their breath steaming in the cold air. And he scattered salt into the furrows instead of seed, his movements wild, his eyes darting as if he had lost his mind. But his wife Penelope, watching from the upper terrace with their infant son Telemachus in her arms, saw the truth in the way his hands gripped the plow handles, steady, deliberate, controlled. He was not mad, but performing madness, hoping the gods, or the messenger, or fate itself, might take pity and let him stay. But when the envoy, a man who had known Odysseus since boyhood, placed the child gently in the path of the plow, Odysseus stopped, not with a cry or a curse, but with a sigh so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself, and in that moment, he understood. The web of oaths was too tightly woven to tear without unraveling everything he loved: his home, his son, his name, and so he nodded, not to the messenger, but to the horizon, and began to prepare not with fanfare, but in silence, sharpening old spears in the courtyard at night, checking the seams of his leather armor by lamplight, speaking softly to his shipwright about reinforcing the hulls of his vessels, all while watching the sea from his cliffside home, as if it might offer an answer it never would, because the sea does not answer, it only carries. In FTI, where the rivers ran clear and cold, and the air smelled of pine and wet stone, even in summer, Achilles trained as he always had, running barefoot along the riverbank at dawn, until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, wrestling with his companions in the dust of the courtyard until blood mixed with sweat on their brows, practicing with spear and shield until the wood of the shaft was smooth from his grip. But now there was a new tension in his movements, a quiet urgency beneath the rhythm, as if every thrust, every parry, every breath were part of a question he could not voice. His mother, Thetis a Cynymph, who had once tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the waters of the Styx, had come to him in a dream the night the first rumor reached them. Her voice, like the whisper of waves over pebbles: "If you stay, you will live long in obscurity, your name forgotten before the first grandchild is born. If you go, your name will burn bright as a star, but your life will be brief as a summer moth." He did not speak of this to his friends, not even to Patroclus, who knew his silences better than his words. He only trained harder, as if strength alone could decide his fate, as if the gods might be moved by the perfection of his form. And when the call finally came, carried by a herald whose voice cracked with exhaustion and awe, Achilles did not hesitate. not because he craved war, but because he feared a life unlived, a name swallowed by time before the first song was sound, so he gathered his men. The Myrmidons, who followed him not out of duty, but out of love, and began to build ships, not with haste, but with the slow certainty of a man walking toward a horizon he cannot avoid, his hands shaping wood that would carry him not to glory, but to the edge of legend. Meanwhile, in Troy, the city still breathed in its ordinary rhythm, untouched by the gathering storm across the sea. Children played near the western gate, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, their games simple and timeless. Chasing goats, skipping stones across the dry ditch, pretending to be heroes from old stories their grandfathers told. Weavers sat in the shade of linen awnings, fingers moving steadily over upright looms, creating patterns of red and ochre and deep indigo that told no story but the one of their hands. The one of their mothers before them, the one of the earth and the sky, and the seasons that turned without asking permission. Farmers brought in the last of the barley harvest, their faces dusted with chaff, their backs bent from the sun, their carts creaking under the weight of grain that would feed the city through winter. No one in the lower town knew that across the Aegean, forests were being felled not for houses or ships of trade, but for war galleys whose prows would be shaped like snarling beasts. That bronze was being cast not for cups or mirrors, but for spearheads and helmet crests. That oaths were being remembered like debts long overdue, and now demanding payment in blood and fire. Troy watched the sea, as it always had. But it watched for traders with amphorae of olive oil and bolts of fine wool, for news from Cyprus or Lesbos, for the return of its own fishermen and merchants, not for the shadow of 1,000 sails gathering on the far horizon like a storm cloud no one had yet seen. Yet subtle signs began to appear, like the first chill before winter, like the faint scent of smoke on the wind long before the fire is visible. A merchant from Lesbos arrived with fewer goods than usual and spoke in hushed tones to the harbor master about strange activity in the ports. Ships being built not with the wide hulls of merchant galleys, but with narrow, swift keels meant for speed and ramming, men gathering not for festivals or markets, but in the open fields beyond the city walls, practicing with shields and spears under the watchful eyes of veterans whose faces were scarred and grim. A fisherman returning from a deep-sea run reported seeing smoke on the distant horizon, not from a village or a temple, but from a fleet anchoring in a hidden cove, their fires kept low, their movements quiet, as if they did not wish to be seen. The palace Antenor, the elder statesman whose hair was white as sea foam and whose voice still carried the weight of 50 years of counsel, grew quiet at meetings, his eyes distant, his words measured, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, as if bracing for a tremor only he could feel. I had traveled widely in his youth, trading cedar and silver from Troy for tin and amber from the north. And he knew the language of preparation when he heard it, the way voices lowered, the way eyes avoided direct contact, the way gifts were exchanged, not as tokens of friendship, but as final gestures before a long absence. He urged caution, diplomacy, perhaps even the return of Helen, not out of fear, but out of wisdom, out of the deep understanding that no wall, no matter how high, can hold back a world that has decided to move against you. Helen herself sensed the shift before anyone spoke of it aloud. She noticed the way the guards at the gate stood a little straighter, their hands resting more deliberately on the hilts of their swords. The conversations in the courtyard fell silent when she approached, not out of malice, but out of uncertainty, as if they did not know how to look at her anymore, not as a guest, not as a queen, but as a question without an answer. She noticed how even the children's games seemed quieter, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. She did not speak of it to anyone, not even to Paris, who moved through the palace with a new tension in his shoulders, a quiet defensiveness in his eyes. She simply moved through her days with a new kind of care, folding her robes more slowly, speaking only when spoken to, watching the horizon from the highest rampart at dusk, not with longing for Sparta, but with a quiet dread she could not name, sense that the peace she had found in Troy's courtyards was as fragile as a spider's web in the morning dew. She had not asked for this. She had only asked for a life that felt like her own. A place where she might be seen not as a symbol, but as a person, and now, that life was becoming a stone around which a storm was gathering, and she could do nothing but wait. In the Aegean, the sea began to change in ways that only the oldest sailors noticed at first. Where once it carried fishing boats with patched sails and merchant galleys flying colorful pennants from a dozen ports, it now filled with the steady, rhythmic dip of oars hundreds, then thousands moving in unison like the legs of some vast creature awakening from a long sleep. Bronze glinted on the decks not in the warm glow of household goods, but in the cold flash of spearheads, helmet crests, and the polished shields of men who had left their fields unplowed. Their wives weeping in doorways, their newborn sons sleeping in cradles they might never see again. They did not sing war songs yet, those would come later, when the fear had hardened into resolve. But they spoke of home, of the weather, of the strange dreams they'd had the night before, setting sail, of the weight of the oaths they carried like stones in their pockets. And beneath those words, a current Rana shared understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. Something that would not end until the earth had drunk its fill, and the gods had decided who would be remembered, who would be forgotten. Back in Troy, Priam called his sons to the inner courtyard one evening, as the stars began to appear one by one in the violet sky. Their light soft and ancient, their patterns unchanged since the city's first stone was laid. He did not speak of war. Not directly, he spoke of duty, of the weight of a city built by their ancestors, not with swords, but with trade, with hospitality, with the quiet courage of generations who had weathered floods and famines and still found time to plant olive trees whose fruit they would never taste. He looked at Paris not with anger, but with the sorrow of a father who sees his child caught in a current he cannot stop, a current that began not with malice, but with a single choice made in the moonlight of a foreign shore. And he looked at Hector, his eldest, the steady one, the one who carried Troy on his shoulders without complaint, whose voice calmed riots, and whose presence steadied the council, and said only his voice low and rough with age. Prepare the walls, not because I believe they will come, but because we must be ready if they do. It was not a declaration of war, not even a plan, it was a whisper, a breath. A father's plea wrapped in the language of Kingsand in that whisper. Troy took its first true step toward defense. Not with drums or proclamations, but with the quiet turning of a key in a long-locked armory. The gods, of course, were said to stir in the clouds above Olympus Athena, sharpening her spear with a stone that sang like a bird. Ares testing the harness of his chariot as his horses stamped and snorted. Hera watching with cold satisfaction from her throne of ivory and gold. But in the human world, there were no thunderbolts splitting the sky, no omens in the flight of birds, no voices from the earth. Only the slow, inevitable turning of a world that had grown too large for its old agreements, too proud for its old compromises, too entangled in the threads of oaths sworn in better times. The promises that once bound men together now pulled them apart, like ropes stretched too tight between two shores drifting further and further apart. And Troy, perched on its hill by the strait where two seas met, became the fulcrum upon which everything would balance, not because it sought power, but because it had become the place where honor, hospitality, and human longing had collided in a way that could not be undone. In the villages beyond the city walls, where farmers lived in houses of mud brick and thatch, and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets and distant dogs, people began to change their routines without speaking of why. They brought their families inside earlier in the evening, not because the dark was dangerous, but because the unknown felt closer. Goats were penned not just at night, but during the day if strangers passed on the road. Watchfires were lit on the hills not as signals, but as quiet reassurance, small points of light saying, "We are here, we are watching." Not because war had come, but because the idea of war had taken root in the soil of daily life, and once planted, it grew quietly, steadily, like ivy on a wall, wrapping itself around every decision, every glance, every breath. People spoke less of the barley harvest and more of rumors of a fleet seen near Chios, its sails black against the sunset, of a king in Argos who had refused to send ships and was now besieged in his own hall by his own people, who said his honor was worth more than his throne, of a prophetess in Delphi who had fallen silent for 3 days and then spoken only one word before collapsing: Troy. Yet, even as the world turned, life in the city continued with a quiet stubbornness that was its own kind of courage. Bread was still baked at dawn in clay ovens, the scent of it rising through the narrow lanes like a prayer. Lullabies were still sung at dusk in courtyards where oil lamps flickered against the coming dark. Lovers still met in the olive groves under the moon, their hands brushing, their voices low, their dreams untouched by the gathering storm. Because humans, even in the face of shadows on the horizon, must eat, must love, must hope, they cannot live only in fear, or they would cease to be human. And Troy, for all its stone and bronze, was made not of walls, but of people who still believed, deep down in the quiet places of their hearts, that the worst might pass them by, that the sea might swallow the threat before it reached their shores, that the gods might yet intervene, not with fire, but with mercy. But the sea does not swallow oaths, it carries them. And across its wind-dark expanse the oars kept moving with a rhythm that was no longer just human, but cosmic, the steady beat of a world turning toward reckoning. The bronze kept glinting in the sun like the eyes of wolves in a forest. The names on the scroll kept echoing in the minds of kings who could no longer pretend they had not sworn to act, who could no longer hide behind the walls of their palaces and say, "This is not my concern." The world was in motion now, not with chaos, but with a terrible, beautiful order, like the turning of the stars in their courses, like the slow drift of continents, like the inevitable pull of the tide. And Troy, watching from its hill with its back to the Anatolian plains and its face to the sea, could only wait its walls warm in the afternoon sun, its gates open as they had always been, because to close them would be to admit that the world they knew was already ending. No one rang a bell, no one sounded an alarm, but in the quiet spaces between breaths, between heartbeats, between the setting of the sun and the rising of the moon, everyone in Troy began to understand, not with words, but with the tightening of a stomach, the quickening of a pulse, the way a mother holds her child a little closer at night, that the time of ordinary days was ending. The world was turning toward war, and there was no path back to the peace they had known, no matter how fiercely they might wish for it. The oaths had been remembered, the ships were building, the oars were dipping, and the only question left was not if, but when. And still, the city stood, its courtyards full of the scent of thyme and baking bread, streets echoing with the soft shuffle of sandals on stone, its people moving through their lives with the quiet dignity of those who do not yet know they are living in the last chapter of peace, but who, in their very humanity, in their refusal to stop loving, stop hoping, stop living, even as the shadows grow long, are already writing the first lines of legend, not with swords, but with the simple, sacred act of enduring. 10 years is a long time to live with the sea at your back and an army at your gate-knot, as a storm that breaks and passes, but as a presence that settles into the bones of the city like damp in winter, seeping into walls, into dreams, into the quiet spaces between heartbeats. 10 years is long enough for a child born at the start of the siege to learn to walk, to speak, to ask why the men on the ramparts never come down, why the ships never leave, why the world beyond the walls feels like a story told by grandparents about a time when the roads were safe and the markets full. And yet, in Troy, life did not stop at Bent. It adapted. It found ways to breathe even when the air felt thick with waiting. Because humans, even under siege, must eat, must love, must hope, or they cease to be human at all. Inside the walls, the rhythm of days changed, not with fanfare, but with subtle shifts in light and sound. The morning no longer began with the clatter of carts heading to the fields, but with the soft shuffle of women walking to the cistern with empty jars, their eyes scanning the horizon not for traders, but for signs of movement in the Greek camp. The scent of baking bread still rose from courtyards, but the loaves were smaller now, made with barley mixed with ground acorns, and shared more carefully among more mouths. Children still played, but their games were quieter, their laughter softer, as if they sensed that joy, too, must be rationed in times like these. And yet in the upper city, near the temple of Athena, a weaver still hummed the same lullaby her mother had sung, her fingers moving steadily over the loom, creating patterns of red and ochre that told no story of war, only of earth and sky and the seasons that turned regardless of human conflict. Hector moved through the city, not as a general, but as a presence, calm, steady, familiar, visiting the lower town to check on grain stores. Speaking softly to elders who remembered sieges from their youth, kneeling in the dust to listen to a child's question about why the sky was so quiet. He did not wear his armor unless he walked the ramparts, and even then he removed his helmet when he spoke to the people, as if to say, "I am still your brother, your neighbor, your son." His courage was not in the clash of bronze, but in the quiet way he carried the weight of the city on his shoulders without letting it crush him. In the way he returned home each evening to hold his son Astyanax, whose small hands reached for his helmet not in fear, but in wonder, and in the way he looked at his wife Andromache not as a queen, but as the woman who kept his heart anchored in the world of the living. Andromache, for her part, lived with a courage that left no songs but shaped every day. She rose before dawn to grind what grain remained, her hands rough from stone and water, her back aching from the weight of worry. She taught her son to speak not of heroes, but of kindness, of sharing, of the names of birds that still sang in the olive trees beyond the walls. She listened to the women of the city as they gathered to wash clothes or spin wool, not to offer solutions, but to hold space for their fears. The mother who feared her son would be called to the walls before his voice deepened. The wife who hadn't heard from her husband in the outer villages in 2 years, the girl who dreamed of a wedding that might never command in that listening, she offered a different kind of resistance. The refusal to let fear, silence, love. Paris, too, carried his own quiet conflict, not the loud regret of a man who knew he had caused this, but the slow, gnawing sorrow of one who saw the cost of his choice in every hollowed cheek, every rationed loaf, every mother's glance that lingered a moment too long before looking away. He still walked the ramparts, still trained with the other men, but he spoke little, and when he did, it was to offer help to carry water, to mend a roof, to stand watch so another could sleep. He did not seek forgiveness, perhaps because he knew it was not his to ask, but he tried, in small ways, to be worthy of the city that had sheltered him even when it cost them everything. And in the evenings, he would sit with Helen in their courtyard, not speaking of Sparta or oaths or gods, but of the way the light fell on the stones, the scent of time after rain, as if by naming the beauty that remained, they could keep it from slipping away. Helen herself became a ghost in her own life, not shunned, not hated, but watched with a quiet distance, as if she were a vessel that held something too fragile or too dangerous to touch. She spent her days in the women's quarters, learning the Trojan ways of weaving, of dyeing thread with madder root and walnut shells, of singing the old songs that called the rain or soothed a crying baby. She did not speak of her past unless asked, and even then her answers were brief, her eyes lowered. But sometimes, in the deepest hour of night, she would climb to the highest rampart and look out at the Greek camp, its fires flickering like fallen stars on the plain, and wonder if Menelaus was out there, if he still thought of her, if he blamed her or himself or the gods. And in those moments, her courage was not in defiance, but in endurance in staying present in a life that offered her no easy escape. No clear redemption, only the slow work of being human in a world that had made her a symbol against her will. The elders of Troy gathered often in the shaded alley near the western gate, where the stones were cool even in summer, and the air smelled of dust and old olive wood. They did not debate strategy, they left that to the younger men. But they spoke of memory, of the floods that had once washed away the lower town, of the famine that lasted 3 winters, of the time the river ran dry and the whole city dug a new well together, passing buckets hand to hand until water finally bubbled up from the earth. In those stories they offered a quiet lesson. We have survived before, we will survive again. Not because they believed the Greeks would leave, but because survival was not just about walls and grain, it was about remembering who you were when the world tried to tell you otherwise. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, the Greek camp settled into its own rhythm of waiting tents patched with sailcloth. Fires kept low at night, the constant murmur of men from 100 cities speaking 100 dialects, all bound by an oath that grew heavier with each passing season. Achilles, for a time, refused to fight, not out of cowardice, but out of wounded pride, and in his tent by the sea, he played the lyre and sang songs of home, his voice low and rough, as if music could fill the hollow where honor used to be. Odysseus walked the shore at dawn, his mind turning like a millstone, always planning, always watching, always waiting for the moment when cleverness would matter more than strength. And Agamemnon, in his tent of purple-dyed wool, grew quieter with each year. His eyes shadowed, his voice softer, as if the weight of leading 1,000 ships was slowly turning him to stone. Inside Troy, the temple of Athena still stood, though its offerings were smaller now, pinch of grain, a drop of oil, a honey cake saved from a child's portion, and the priestesses still sang at dawn, their voices rising like smoke toward the sky, not to beg for victory, but for endurance, for wisdom, for the strength to see another sunrise. The gods were not distant judges in this time, but neighbors who watched from the hills and the stars. And the people did not worship for salvation, but for continuity, for rain, for healthy children, for safe return from the ramparts. And in that quiet faith, there was a kind of courage that left no monuments, but held the city together like invisible thread. Food grew scarcer as the years passed, but never disappeared, not because the stores were endless, but because the people learned to share without being asked. A family with extra lentils would leave a bowl at a neighbor's door. A potter would trade a repaired bowl for a handful of dried figs. A weaver would give a scrap of cloth to wrap a child's cold feet. These were not grand acts of heroism, but small, daily choices to refuse despair, to say with every gesture, "We are still here. We still care." And in a world where the enemy waited just beyond the walls, that refusal was its own kind of war. Children born during the siege knew no other life. They did not miss the open roads or the full markets because they had never seen them. To them, Troy was the whole world, its walls the edge of the sky, its courtyards the center of all that mattered. They played games that mimicked the rhythms of siege-not battles, but grain guard or water runner, their imaginations shaping survival into play. And when they asked why the men on the ramparts carried spears, their elders did not speak of enemies, but of protection, of duty, of the quiet work of keeping a home safe. In this way, the city passed on not fear, but resilience, not as a lesson, but as a lullaby. There were no great speeches in Troy during these years, no proclamations carved in stone. The courage was in the woman who sang while grinding grain, though her hands ached, the boy who carried water to the watchtower, though his legs trembled, in the old man who told stories of better days not to escape the present, but to remind everyone that time moves, that seasons change, that even the longest night ends, and in the silence between the clang of bronze and the cry of gulls, the city breathed not with the breath of warriors, but with the breath of those who choose, every day, to live as if tomorrow still matters. No one knew how long the siege would last. Some whispered it would end when the Greeks grew tired. Others said it would end only when the gods decided, but no one spoke of surrender, not because they were proud, but because surrender would mean the end of everything they were: the stories, the songs, the way bread was baked, the way names were passed from mother to daughter. And so they endured, not with shouts, but with sighs, not with fury, but with faith in each other, in the walls, in the quiet certainty that as long as one hearth still burned, Troy was not lost. And in that endurance, in that quiet refusal to let fear have the final word, lay a courage deeper than any battlefield glory, a courage that did not seek to be remembered, but simply to be lived. One ordinary, tender, human day at a time. It began not with a trumpet or a shout, not with fire or fury, but with an absence so complete it felt like the world had forgotten how to breathe. The Greek camp, which for 10 long years had clung to the plain like a second city of tents and watchfires and the constant low hum of foreign voices, was gone, vanished, as if the earth had swallowed it whole, or the sea had drawn it back into its depths with a single silent wave. Where once there had been the glint of bronze at dawn, the smell of cooking fires, the rhythmic clang of men training with spear and shield, there was now only trampled grass, cold ash, and the hollow silence of a stage after the actors have left, leaving behind only the faint impression of their presence in the dust and the wind. The people of Troy gathered on the ramparts at first light, not cheering, not celebrating, but watching with the wary eyes of those who have learned through a decade of waiting. peace offered to Isili is often a mask for something else. And yet, as the hours passed and no sails appeared on the horizon, as no drum sounded in the distance, as the silence stretched unbroken into afternoon, a quiet hope began to unfurl in the courtyards and alleyways of the city, a hope so fragile it dared not speak its name, but which nonetheless softened the lines around tired eyes and loosened the grip on weapons that had grown familiar as extensions of the hand. Down on the shore, where the waves lapped gently against the sand, with the same rhythm they had kept since the city's first stone was laid, stood a single object left behind like a riddle carved in wood or horse, vast and hollow, its flanks smooth from the hands of craftsmen who had shaped it not for war, but for wonder, its eyes inlaid with polished obsidian that caught the morning light like tears held back, its mane and tail rendered in delicate curls of cedar, its hooves planted firmly in the sand as if it had walked there of its own accord and chosen to stay. It bore no weapons, no armor, no markings of any king or god. Only a simple inscription near its base, carved in Greek letters that few in Troy could read, but whose meaning was guessed from context. For Athena, in thanks for a safe journey home, a gesture of piety that felt both foreign and strangely familiar, like a prayer spoken in a half-remembered dream. And as the people descended from the walls to gather around it, they did not reach for spears or stones, but for their children's hands, their neighbors' shoulders, their own sense of awe. Touching the wooden flank as if to confirm it was real, marveling at the joinery, the scale, the quiet dignity of a thing built not to destroy, but to be seen, to be offered, to be received. Inside the city, the news spread, not as a cry, but as a ripple first from the watchman on the western tower, then to the women drawing water at the cistern, then to the potters in the lower town, then to the elders in the shaded alley where they played knucklebones in the afternoon heat, and by midday, the entire upper city knew. The Greeks were gone, and a horse remained. The council was called not in the great hall, but in the inner courtyard of the palace, where sunlight filtered through latticework, and the scent of myrtle hung in the air, like a memory of better days. And there, beneath the open sky that had watched over Troy for centuries, the leaders of the city gathered not as generals, but as fathers, as brothers, as men who had buried sons and friends, and still carried the weight of every loss in the quiet spaces between their ribs. Untiner, his hair white as sea foam, his voice softer now but no less firm, spoke first. "We do not know why they left. We do not know what this horse means, but I say, do not bring it inside the walls. Let it stand on the shore as a monument to their departure, not as a guest in our home." His words were not born of fear, but of wisdom, of the deep understanding that some gifts carry thorns hidden beneath their petals, and that the most dangerous lies are often wrapped in the language of gratitude. Others spoke in turn, elders, who remembered the cunning of Odysseus from earlier skirmishes, merchants who had traded with Greeks and knew their love of riddles and tricks, priests who consulted the smoke of incense and saw only favorable signs curling toward the skyand. Their voices mingled in the courtyard like threads in a loom, some weaving caution, others weaving hope, all of them tired, all of them longing for an ending that did not require more blood. And Paris, standing near the back with his arms crossed not in defiance but in quiet sorrow, said little. But his silence spoke volumes. He had seen the Greek mind at work in Sparta, felt its charm and its sharpness, and though he wanted to believe this was truly over, he could not shake the feeling that something was waiting in the stillness, something coiled and patient like a snake in the grass. But even he, when pressed, could not deny the emptiness of the plain, the absence of sails, the silence that felt for the first time in 10 years like peace. And so he nodded, not in agreement, but in surrender to the collective will of a city that had reached the edge of its endurance and chose, in that moment, to believe in grace rather than guile. Cassandra stood apart from the others, as she always did, her hair loose and unbound, her robes simple and undyed, her eyes wide, not with madness, but with a clarity so sharp it seemed to cut through the air like a blade. She had walked the ramparts all night, long after the last Greek fire had died, feeling the shift in the wind, hearing the silence that was not empty, but full of breath held too long, full of oars waiting in the dark, full of the terrible patience of men who had nothing left to lose. When she entered the courtyard, the elders fell quiet, not out of respect, but out of habit, the same way one might pause when passing a grave. She did not raise her voice, did not gesture wildly, did not weep. She simply stood before them and said, her words falling like stones into still water, "Do not bring it in. It is not a gift. It is a mouth waiting to open." Inside, men breathe. Inside, swords sleep. Inside, Troy ends. But no one listened. Not because they did not hear her, but because they could not bear to. They had waited too long for hope to let it be taken away by a voice that always spoke of shadows. And so they turned away, not in anger, but in sorrow, as if closing a door on a truth they were not ready to face. And in that turning, they sealed their fate not with a decree, but with a sigh. The decision was not made in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, children tugging at their mother's robes, asking if the war was over and if they could play beyond the gates again. Priests declaring the horse a sacred offering that must be honored lest the goddess Athena turn her face from the city. Craftsmen marveling at the joinery, wondering how such a thing could be moved, and volunteering ropes and wheels and strong backs. Finally, the order came not from Priam, who sat in silence in his chamber, his hands trembling in his lap as he thought of his sons and his grandsons and the world they would never know, but from the collective will of a people who had carried the weight of siege for so long that they chose, in their exhaustion, to believe in kindness over caution, in hope over fear, in the possibility of an ending that did not require more blood. And so, with songs and laughter that had not been heard in years, with ropes woven from hemp and wheels fashioned from olive wood, the great horse was pulled through the gates, its shadow stretching long across the stones like a promisor, a warning, and, as it passed under the archway, the city exhaled a breath it had held for 10 years, not with triumph, but with the quiet disbelief of those who have waited so long for peace that they no longer know how to greet it when it comes. That night, Troy celebrated not with feasts or wine, but with relief, a quiet unspooling of tension that had coiled in every shoulder, every breath, every heartbeat for a decade. Lamps burned later than usual in the courtyards, their flames steady and golden in the still air. Mothers let their children stay up to watch the stars, pointing out constellations and telling stories of heroes who were not warriors, but farmers, weavers, healers. Old songs were sung again, the ones about harvests and weddings and journeys that ended in homecoming, their melodies soft and familiar as a well-worn blanket. And on the ramparts, the guards lowered their spears, not because they were told to, but because the plain was empty, the sea calm, the world finally still. For the first time in memory, the great gates were left open, not out of carelessness, but as a gesture of trust in the gods, in fate, in the simple belief that the worst was behind them, and that the future, however uncertain, would at least be their own to shape. Inside the horse, hidden in the belly of wood and shadow, men held their breath not with fear, but with the terrible focus of those who know that everything depends on silence. They did not speak, did not shift, did not even blink too loudly. They listened to the sounds of the city below, the murmur of voices, the clink of cups, the distant strum of a lyrant. In those sounds, they heard not enemies, but people, tired, hopeful, human. A child laughed somewhere in the square. A woman sang a lullaby through an open window. An old man coughed softly in the night air. And for a moment, some of them wondered if this was worth it. If glory was worth the weight of what they were about to do, if the oaths they had sworn were heavier than the lives they were about to end. But the years had hardened them, the losses had shaped them, and so they waited, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Their eyes closed, not in sleep, but in prayer for the dawn that would not bring peace, but fire. Meanwhile, in the palace, Priam sat with Hecuba in their private chamber, the oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls that had witnessed the birth of 50 children and the death of too many. They did not speak of the horse or the Greeks or the future. They spoke of their children, of the ones still living, of the ones lost, of the way Astyanax laughed when Hector lifted him onto his shoulders and called him Little King. And in that quiet space, They allowed themselves to hope, just for an hour, that the war was truly over, that their grandchildren might grow up in a world without ramparts, without watchfires, without the constant hum of dread that had become the background music of their lives. Hecuba reached for her husband's hand, her fingers rough from years of weaving and worry, and held it tightly, not saying a word, because some truths do not need voices, they only need presence. Helen walked the upper terrace alone, her bare feet cool on the stone, her eyes fixed on the horse standing in the center of the square like a monument to something no one could name. She did not know what it meant, but she felt it, the shift in the air. The way the stars seemed brighter, the way the wind carried a different kind of silence, one that hummed with anticipation rather than peace. She thought of Menelaus, of Sparta, of the life she had left behind, and wondered if, somewhere across the sea, he was looking at the same stars, thinking of her, waiting for the signal that would tell him the plan had worked. And in that moment, she made no choice, took no action. She simply existed in the in-between. A woman caught in a story too large for her to control, but too real to ignore, and in her stillness. There was a kind of courage that left no songs but shaped the night. As midnight passed and the city sank into sleep, the gates were finally closed, not by order, but by habit. The last lamp in the square was extinguished. The horse stood alone in the darkness, its obsidian eyes reflecting nothing, its hollow belly full of breath and bronze. And then, slowly, silently, the trapdoor opened, and men began to descend not as conquerors, but as shadows, their movements precise,
Other steps soundless.
their hearts heavy with the knowledge that what they did now would echo long after their names were forgotten. They moved through the streets, not with rage, but with purpose, unlocking the gates from within, signaling to the fleet that had sailed back under cover of darkness, lighting the signal fire on the western tower not with triumph, but with the quiet finality of a task completed. And still, the city's slept mothers, dreaming of their children's futures. Potters dreaming of new clay, weavers dreaming of patterns yet to be woven, unaware that the turning point had already passed, that the shadows had already spoken, that the world they knew was already ending. There was no grand battle that night, no clash of armies, only the soft sound of a gate opening, the distant cry of a single gull, the first flicker of flame on the horizon as the Greek ships returned like wolves to a fold they had never truly left. And in the space between sleep and waking, between peace and ruin, Troy took its last breath as it had lived, quietly, humanly, beautifully unaware of the edge it stood upon. Its people wrapped in the fragile illusion of safety, its walls still standing tall against the night, its hearth still warm with the embers of ordinary life. For the true tragedy of that night was not the horse, not the fire, not the swords. It was the moment the city chose to believe in kindness over caution, in hope over fear, in the possibility of an ending that did not require more blood. And though that choice led to ruin, it was not foolish, it was profoundly, achingly human, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest times, people will reach for light, even if it burns them. And in that humanity, fragile, flawed, tender, lies the real story of that night. Not how Troy fell, but how it lived, even in its final hours. With its gates open, and its heart still willing to trust, as if to say that to be human is not to be perfect, but to keep hoping, even when the world offers no reason to. In the first gray light that followed the longest night, the city did not lie in the kind of ruin that poets would later carve into marble or sing about in halls lit by torchlight. There were no toppled towers crashing like fallen giants, no rivers running red with the blood of heroes, no dramatic silhouettes of broken statues against a burning sky. But instead, a silence so complete it seemed the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. A stillness that settled into the courtyards and alleyways like dust after a storm, soft and suffocating. And in that silence, the true weight of what had happened began to press down, not with noise, but with absence, the absence of children's laughter echoing off the western gate, the absence of the weaver's shuttle clicking steadily in the afternoon shade, the absence of the low hum of voices sharing bread and stories under the stars. The walls still stood in places, though blackened by flame, their stones warm to the touch even at dawn, radiating the memory of the heat that had consumed everything within, and the air carried a scent that was not just of ash. but of wet wool left to smolder, of barley bread turned to charcoal in the ovens, of cedar wood beams that had once held up roofs and dreams now reduced to embers, and beneath it all, the faint, sweet decay of figs that had fallen from the trees during the chaos and were now soft and forgotten on the ground, their juice mingling with soot and rainwater to create a smell that was neither wholly of life nor death, but of something in between, something lost. Priam was going to nod in the blaze of battle that might have granted him a song, not in the arms of his sons with his name on their lips, but alone on the cold stone floor of his own courtyard, his white hair matted with dust and something darker, his hands curled as if trying to hold on to the last threads of a life that had slipped through his fingers long before the Greeks ever landed on the shore. No one had seen the moment it happened. Perhaps it was swift. Perhaps it was slow, but when the women of the palace found him in the pale morning light, they did not scream, did not wail, did not call for the gods. They simply knelt, their robes brushing the ash-covered stones, and covered him with a clean shawl taken from the linen chest that still stood in the corner of what had been the queen's chamber, its contents miraculously untouched by fire. And then they began to sing the old morning song, the one that asked the earth to be gentle with the bones of the king who had ruled longer than most of the olive trees in the royal orchard had lived, whose voice had calmed riots, and whose presence had steadied the city through floods and famines, and now, in death, left a hollow so vast it seemed the very sky had dimmed in response. His crown was nowhere to be found, perhaps taken as a trophy, perhaps buried under rubble, perhaps lost in the river when someone tried to flee with it. But it did not matter, because his true crown had never been gold or silver, but the quiet respect in his people's eyes, the way a child would lower their voice when he passed, the way elders would nod when he spoke in council, and that too was gone, scattered like ash on the wind. Impossible to gather, impossible to restore. Andromache searched for hours through the lower town, her voice hoarse from calling her son's name, her feet bleeding from broken pottery and fallen roof tiles and the sharp edges of things that had once been whole spindles. Bowls, toys carved from olive wood, and with every step, the hope that had carried her through the night grew thinner, until it was little more than a thread trembling in the wind. She found him not in the nursery where she had left him with his nurse, not in the temple where she had once prayed for his safety, not curled in the arms of his father as he sometimes was after a nightmare, but in the hands of a Greek soldier near the western gate, his small body limp, his eyes closed as if he were sleeping, his tiny fingers still curled around a smooth river stone he must have picked up that morning before the world ended. She did not weep then. She simply took him, wrapped him in the shawl she had been carrying, and walked back to the palace, her steps steady, her face dry, as if grief had not yet found its way into her bones, as if her body were waiting for permission to break. Later, in the quiet of what remained of her chamber, its walls cracked, its roof open to the sky, its loom overturned but still strung with half-finished thread, she would sit by the cold hearth and sing him the lullaby she had made up when he was born, the one about the little king who would one day ride a horse made of clouds and rule a city where no one ever had to say goodbye. And as she sang, the tears would finally come, not for the loss itself, but for the future that would never be, for the stories he would never hear, for the man he would never become, for the sound of his voice calling her mother one more time. Hector's armor lay abandoned near the gate where he had made his last stand, its bronze dented and blackened, its leather straps cut, its crest of horsehair trampled into the mud and mixed with ash and blood that had long since dried to rust.
What?
No one took it not out of disrespect, but because it was too heavy with memory, too full of the man who had worn it not as a symbol of war, but as a shield for his city, for his family, for the ordinary people who walked the streets and baked bread and sang songs in courtyards. The sword he had carried since his first watch on the ramparts was found weeks later by a farmer plowing the plain beyond the lower town. Its blade snapped cleanly in two, its hilt wrapped in cloth that had once been red but was now the color of rust and rain. And though the farmer knew whose it must have been, he did not keep it as a relic or display it in his home. He simply buried it under a young olive tree on the edge of his field, where the roots would hold it gently, and the fruit would grow sweet above it as if life insisted on continuing, even over loss, even over grief, even over the sharpest edges of memory. The temple of Athena stood empty, its altar cracked down the middle as if struck by lightning. Its offerings scattered honey cakes hardened into stone. Oil spilled across the floor in dark pools that reflected the broken sky. A child's clay offering of a bird with one wing missing, left by someone who had believed the goddess would protect them. The priestesses were gone, some taken, some fled into the hills. Some silent in corners of the city where no one dared to look into the songs that had risen at dawn for centuries, carried on the voices of women who had learned them from their mothers and would have taught them to their daughters, were heard no more. Yet, in the weeks that followed, an old woman who had once swept the temple steps as a girl would come each morning before sunrise, her broom made of bundled reeds, her back bent with age, when she would sweep not because she believed the goddess still listened, not because she expected anything in return, but because someone had to remember how it was done, how the broom should move in slow arcs, how the dust should fall in gentle clouds, how the light should enter through the eastern window at this hour and fall across the threshold like a blessing. And in that sweeping, in that quiet repetition of a gesture that no one else remembered, there was a kind of prayer, not for return, not for justice, but for remembrance, for the simple act of saying, "This was here. This mattered." Helen walked through the ruins not as a queen, not as the cause of 10 years of war, not as the face that launched 1,000 ships, but as a woman carrying the weight of a name that no longer belonged to her, a name that had become a story told by others, shaped by poets and soldiers and kings who had never looked into her eyes and seen the quiet sorrow there. She did not speak to the Greeks, who now guarded the gates, nor to the few Trojans who avoided her gaze or whispered behind their hands when she passed. She simply moved through the streets, her bare feet cool on the ash-covered stones, her hands reaching out to pick up what could be saved a spindle with its threads still intact. A child's sandal made of soft leather, a shard of pottery painted with a bird in flight, its colors still bright despite the smoke. And placing each item gently into the basket, she carried on her hip, as if by gathering these fragments, she could somehow keep the city from vanishing entirely, could hold on to the ordinary things that had made Troy real. The weight of a loaf of bread fresh from the oven, the sound of a loom clicking in the afternoon heat, the scent of thyme crushed underfoot in the courtyard, the way the light fell through the latticework at dusk. She knew she would leave soon, would return to Sparta with Menelaus, would resume a life that felt like a costume she'd no longer fit. But before she went, she wanted to hold, just once, the truth of what she had found here, not glory, not passion, but peace, however brief, however fragile. The weaver's quarter was silent. The looms stood still, their threads tangled, their patterns unfinished, their shuttles lying where they had been dropped in haste or fear. One loom held a half-woven tapestry of red and ochre and deep indigo, the design unclear. Perhaps it was meant to show a harvest, golden fields under a summer sun, or a wedding procession winding through the streets, or simply the play of light on water at dawn, and no one would ever know what it was meant to be, because the weaver who had started it was gone, her name already fading from memory like ink in the rain. But weeks later, a young girl from the hills, whose family had hidden in the caves during the sack and had only just returned to see what remained, came down to the city and stood before that loom for a long time, her fingers tracing the threads, her eyes following the pattern as far as it went. She did not know the weaver, did not know the intended design, but she knew how to weave, had learned at her grandmother's knee in the cave by lamplight, and so she sat, picked up the shuttle, and continued not to finish what was started, not to replicate a vision she could not see, but to say with every pass of the thread, with every click of the loom, "We are still here, we remember, go on." The river Scamander ran dark for days, not with blood, as the songs would later claim in their hunger for drama, but with ash and clay and the runoff from fires that had burned through homes and storerooms and temples, carrying with it the remnants of lives that had been lived and lost. Fish floated belly up in the shallows, their silver scales dull under the gray sky, and the reeds along the bank were blackened and brittle, snapping at the slightest touch. But by the next moon, the rains came, gentle and steady, washing the plain clean, and the water ran clear again, and children, those who remained, those who had hidden. Those who had been spared returned to its banks to wash clothes, to skip stones, to laugh in the way children always do, as if the world had not ended, as if it never could. And in their laughter, there was no forgetting. How could there be? But a quiet refusal to let sorrow be the only truth, a stubborn insistence that joy, however small, however fleeting, still had a place in the world, even among the ruins. What was lost could not be counted in stones or gold, or even in lives. It was in the songs not sung, the names not passed down from mother to daughter, the recipes not taught over a shared hearth, the jokes not shared in the cool of evening, the quiet moments between lovers that would never happen, the dreams that would never be dreamed. It was in the potter who would never shape another bowl for his granddaughter's wedding, the mother who would never braid her daughter's hair on her first day as a woman, the elder who would never tell the story of the great flood that had once washed away the lower town, his voice rising and falling like the river itself. And yet what remained was not nothing. It was the memory of how bread was baked, how wool was spun, how a city could stand for centuries, not because of its high walls or its strategic position, but because of the hands that built them, the hearts that loved them, the voices that sang within them. And those memories, though fragile, were not gone. They were carried in the bodies of those who survived, in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked at the stars, and remembered that once they had done so from a courtyard full of light and laughter. There were no grand lessons carved in stone that day, no proclamations about the dangers of pride or the will of the gods, or the futility of war, only the quiet understanding felt in the bones of those who walked the ash-covered streets, that peace is fragile, that trust is a gift that can be broken in a single night, and that even the strongest walls cannot protect what lives in the spaces between people. Kindness, doubt, hope, fear, the simple act of offering bread to a stranger. And perhaps the deepest lesson was this, that to be human is to build, even when you know it might fall, to love, even when you know it might end, to sing, even when no one is left to hear.
Us.
And that the true measure of a life is not in how it ends, but in how it was lived, in the small mercies, the quiet courtesies, the ordinary moments that, taken together, make a world worth remembering. In the days that followed, the survivors did not speak of blame or glory or destiny. They spoke of practical things, or to find clean water now that the cisterns were cracked, how to rebuild a roof before the autumn rains came, whether the olive trees in the royal orchard would bear fruit again next season. They shared what little they had not out of generosity, though there was that too, but out of necessity. Because to hoard in a world so broken was to invite a different kind of death, and in that sharing, in the passing of a cup of water, the offering of a blanket, the holding of a hand in silence, they found a new kind of strength, not the strength of warriors who charge into battle, but the strength of those who choose to live when everything around them tells them to give up, to lie down, to let the ashes cover them. And in their quiet work, in their mended clothes and patched roofs and shared meals cooked over open fires in courtyards that had once held feasts, Troy began slowly, almost imperceptibly, to breathe again, not as it was, not as it had been for centuries, but as it could be, shaped by loss, but not defined by it. Light returned, not with the sun, though the sun still rose each morning as it always had, but with small, almost invisible acts. A woman lighting a lamp in a ruined courtyard, not to see, but to say that darkness would not have the final word. A child planting a seed in the ash near the western gate, not knowing if it would grow, but needing to believe it might. An old man humming a tune while he swept the steps of a temple that no longer held a god, his voice rough with age but steady with memory. These were not acts of defiance against the Greeks or the gods or fate. They were acts of continuity. Quiet affirmations that life, however broken, however scarred, is still worth living.
8.
That memory is not just about the past, but about carrying something forward into the unknown, about saying to the future, here is what we were, here is what we loved, here is what we lost. We go on. And in the space between loss and survival, between ash and green shoot, between silence and song, there was a kind of grace, not the grace of heroes or gods or epic poems, but the grace of ordinary people who, in the face of utter ruin, chose to remember how to be human, to care for one another, to share what little they had, to hope. Even if only for one more day, one more sunrise, one more breath. And in that grace, in that quiet, uncelebrated courage, lay the true heart of Troynot in its walls, not in its gold, not in its legends, but in the simple, sacred act of enduring, of loving, of remembering, even when the world tries to make you forget. For what was lost was real, and the pain of it would echo for generations. Carried in songs and stories, and the quiet spaces between heartbeats, but what remained, however fragile, however small, was enough. It was always enough. In the hours after the fire, when the sky was still gray with ash and the air thick with the scent of wet soot and charred cedar, a small group of survivors gathered not in the square or the temple, but in the shadow of the western wall, where the stones had shielded a narrow alley from the worst of the flames. They did not speak of revenge or return. They spoke in whispers of survival, of who might still be alive in the hills, of which paths were safest under the cover of night, and among them stood Aeneas, not as a hero, not as a founder of empires, but as a son carrying his aging father on his back, his hands gripping the old man's legs with a tenderness that belied the chaos around them, his eyes scanning the darkness, not for enemies, but for his young son, who clung to his hand with fingers small and trembling. His face streaked with tears and soot, his voice too hoarse to cry. They carried nothing but what they wore and a small bundle tied with twine, perhaps a loaf of bread saved from the pantry, perhaps a household god carved from olive wood, perhaps just the weight of everything they could not leave behind. And as they slipped through the broken gate and into the fields beyond, they did not look back, not out of indifference, but because to look would be to break, and they could not afford to break, not yet. The journey began in silence, broken only by the crunch of ash underfoot, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft shuffle of sandals on stone. They moved like shadows through the olive groves, their steps careful, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding not with fear alone, but with the terrible weight of being among the last to carry Troy's name into the unknown. Aeneas did not speak of destiny or gods or the future. He spoke only to his father, asking if he was comfortable, if his back hurt, if he needed to rest. And Anchises, his voice weak but steady, would murmur stories instead of answers, tales of his own childhood in the city, the taste of figs from the royal orchard, of the way the light fell on the temple of Athena at Donand in those stories. There was no lament, only love, as if by speaking them. He could keep the city alive in the air between them, if only for a little while longer. Elsewhere, other survivors were doing the same, not in grand processions, but in quiet departures. A weaver and her 2 daughters slipping into the hills with a spindle and a bundle of thread. A potter carrying a single bowl he had managed to save from the fire, its glaze still intact, its shape familiar as a face. A priestess with a small clay statue of a goddess wrapped in cloth, hidden in the folds of her robe. They did not plan to rebuild Troy. They knew that was impossible, but they carried with them the things that mattered most. Not gold or weapons, but the ordinary objects that held memory, the gestures that held meaning, the songs that held sorrow and hope in equal measure. And in their pockets, in their bundles, in their hearts, they carried seeds, not just of barley or lentils, but of stories, of recipes, of lullabies, of the way a city once lived, loved, and dreamed under the same stars that now watched over their flight. As they walked through the night, the smoke from the burning city rose behind them like a shroud, curling into the sky and mingling with the clouds, and though it smelled of loss, it also carried something else, the faint, stubborn scent of life persisting. The green shoots of wheat already pushing through the ash in the fields, the roots of olive trees deep in the earth, the eggs of birds hidden in the reeds along the river bank. And in that smoke there was a kind of promise, not that Troy would rise again in stone and bronze, but that what it had been would not be forgotten, that its spirit would travel with those who carried its memory. Like seeds carried on the wind to lands unknown, waiting for the right soil, the right rain, the right moment to take root once more. Aeneas and his small group reached the coast by dawn, their feet blistered, their throats dry, their eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. They found a small fishing boat, half hidden in the reeds, its owner long gone, its sails patched, but serviceable, and without a word. They pushed it into the water, the wood groaning softly as if it too remembered the city they had left behind. As the oars dipped into the sea and the shore began to recede, Aeneas finally looked back not at the flames, which had died to embers, but at the hill where the citadel stood, its outline softened by morning mist. And in that moment, he did not see ruins, he saw home. And the ache of it was so deep it felt like a second wound, one that would never fully heal. But he turned forward again, not because he was ready to let go, but because his son needed him to be strong, and strength, in that moment, meant rowing toward the horizon, even when every part of him wanted to stay. In the weeks and months that followed, the survivors scattered like dandelion seeds on the wind, some to the islands of the Aegean, some to the coasts of Anatolia, some farther west, to lands where no one had ever heard of Troy. They did not announce themselves as refugees or royalty. They simply arrived, weary and quiet, offered their hands in exchange for shelter, their skills in exchange for bread. The weaver taught local women how to dye thread with madder root so it would never fade. The potter showed boys how to shape clay so it would hold water without cracking. The priestess sang songs to the goddess that sounded like lullabies but carried the weight of centuries. And in these small exchanges, Troy began to live again not as a city, but as a thread woven into other cultures, other lives, other stories. The stories began to travel to naught in scrolls or monuments. But in the way a mother sang a lullaby to her child, the melody slightly changed, but the heart of it still Trojan. In the way a farmer told his son about a city that once stood by the sea, its walls high, its people kind, its fall tragic but not shameful. In the way a sailor, years later, would point to a hill on the horizon and say, "My grandfather came from there," his voice low with reverence, though he had never seen the place himself. And these stories, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, were not always accurate. Names were changed, events compressed, heroes softened into men, but they were true in spirit. And that was what mattered. They kept the memory alive, not as history, but as breath. Aeneas, for his part, would eventually find a new home not in a day, not without hardship, but in time on there. He would plant the seeds he had carried. Seeds of grain, yes, but also seeds of memory. He would tell his son the stories of Troy, not as tales of glory, but as lessons in humility, in compassion, in the quiet courage of ordinary people who faced ruin with dignity. And his son would tell them to his children, and they too theirs, until the name Troy became less a place and more a feeling, a sense of loss. Yes, but also of resilience, of the belief that even when everything is taken, something can still be built from the ashes. What survived was not the gold or the walls or the names of kings, it was the way bread was baked, the way wool was spun, the way a lullaby could soothe a crying child, even in the darkest night. It was the gesture of offering a cup of water to a stranger, the act of planting a seed in scorched earth, the quiet decision to keep singing even when no one is left to hear. And these things, small and ordinary as they were, proved stronger than fire, stronger than time, stronger than the swords of 1,000 armies, because they were human, and humanity, however broken, always finds a way to begin again. In the smoke that rose from Troy's final night, there were no grand prophecies, no divine signs, no thunder from the heavens, only the soft rustle of feet on stone, the whisper of a father to his son, the quiet resolve of those who chose to carry what they could into the unknown. And in that smoke, seeds were born not of destruction, but of continuation, of memory, of hope. And though the city of stone was gone, the city of spirit was just beginning its journey, carried on the backs of the weary, the hands of the faithful, the voices of the quiet ones who refused to let the story end. For a legacy is not built in monuments, but in moments, in the way a child learns to weave from her mother, in the way a song is passed down through generations, in the way a name is spoken with love long after the person is gone. And Troy's legacy was not in the horse or the war or the fall, but in the lives that continued after, in the stories that traveled, in the quiet courage of those who said, with every step they took away from the ruins, "We are still here, we remember, we go on." And so, from the smoke, seeds took flight, on the wind, on the sea. In the hearts of those who carried them, and, though they landed in foreign soil, They took root, not as invaders, but as guests, not as conquerors, but as keepers of a memory that refused to die. And in their growing, they whispered the name of a city that once stood by the sea, not with fanfare, but with love, not as a warning, but as a lullaby for the ages. For Troy did not end in fire, it began again in memory, in story, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats where all true legacies live. And as long as someone tells the tale of a father carrying his son through the ashes, of a weaver saving her spindle, of a city that chose to trust even when it cost them everything, Troy is not lost. It is simply waiting, in the seeds, in the smoke, in the dreams of those who listen, to be remembered once more. Long after the last torch had burned out, long after the last survivor had carried their memories into exile or old age, long after the names of kings and heroes had faded from daily speech and become the stuff of half-remembered songs, the hill by the sea remained not as a monument, not as a warning, but simply as a place where the earth continued its quiet work of healing, of covering, of folding time into itself like a mother tucking a child into bed. The stones of Troy's walls, once proud and gleaming in the sun, slowly crumbled under the weight of rain and wind and the patient fingers of ivy, their edges softened, their lines blurred, till they no longer looked like the work of human hands, but like outcroppings of the land itself, as if the city had not been built, but grown and then returned to the soil from which it came. And in the silence that followed, a new kind of life began to take root, not with fanfare, but with the gentle persistence of grass pushing through cracked stone, of wildflowers blooming in courtyards where lullabies had once been sung, of birds nesting in the hollows where watchfires had once burned. Farmers from the nearby villages were the first to return, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. They came with ox-drawn plows and wooden hoes, their eyes not on the past, but on the future, on the promise of fertile soil enriched by centuries of human habitation, by ash and bone and the slow decay of wood and cloth and dreams. They did not see ruins, they saw fields, and in those fields they planted barley, lentils, olives, their hands moving with the same rhythm their ancestors had used long before Troy ever rose on the hill. The plowshare turned up fragments as it went, shards of pottery painted with birds and waves, pieces of bronze too corroded to recognize. A child's spindle whirl smoothed by Timon. The farmers did not stop to wonder whose hands had shaped them or what stories they held, simply gathered the sharpest pieces to avoid cutting the oxen's feet, and left the rest to be buried again, deeper this time, closer to the heart of the earth, where memory sleeps but does not die. Seasons turned, as they always do, indifferent to human triumph or tragedy. Spring came with its rains and its green shoots, summer with its golden heat and buzzing insects, autumn with its harvest and its falling leaves, winter with its silence and its snow-dusted stones. And with each passing year, the outline of the city grew fainter, the walls lower, the gates indistinguishable from the natural rise of the land. Children played on the hill, not knowing they ran where kings had walked, where lovers had whispered, where mothers had wept. They built forts from the fallen stones, told ghost stories about the old place, and then forgot them by morning, their imaginations already turning to the next game, the next season, the next life that was entirely their own. And in their forgetting, there was no disrespect, only the natural flow of time, which carries all things forward, even the most sacred memories, until they become part of the landscape, part of the air, part of the quiet hum of the world. Yet not all memory vanished. In the villages that ringed the plain, elders would sometimes point to the hill at dusk and say, "That's where the great city stood," their voices low, their eyes distant, as if speaking of a dream they had once had and could not quite recall. They told stories, not the grand epics of poets, but smaller tales, of a potter who made bowls so thin they sang when tapped, of a weaver whose red dye never faded, of a king who walked among his people without guards. These stories were not written down, not carved in stone, but passed from grandmother to granddaughter while spinning wool, from father to son while mending nets, and in that passing they lived in not as history, as breath, as heartbeat, as the quiet knowledge that something beautiful had once been here, even if no one could say exactly what it was. Poets came too, though not at first. Centuries passed before anyone thought to sing of Troy again, and when they did, it was not in the courts of kings, but by firelight in humble homes, their voices rough with smoke and age, their lyres patched with twine. They did not recite the full tale of war and horses and gods, they sang fragments. Echoes, a mother's lullaby, a sailor's prayer to the sea, the sound of a gate closing at night. And their audiences did not listen for glory, but for connection, for the sense that they, too, were part of a long line of people who had loved, lost, hoped, and endured. In those songs, Troy was not a lesson or a warning, it was a mirror. A reminder that every life, no matter how small, leaves a ripple in the water of time. The river Scamander still flowed, its course unchanged, its waters clear in spring, muddy in autumn, its banks lined with reeds and willows, just as they had been in the days of Priam and Hector. Fishermen cast their nets in the same shallows, their movements slow and practiced, their boats bobbing gently in the current. They did not think of the blood that songs claimed had once stained the water, they thought of the fish, of the weather, of the price the market would pay. And yet, in the quiet moments between casts, when the sun hung low and the world seemed to hold its breath, some of them would look up at the hill and feel a strange stillness in their chests, a sense of standing on sacred ground, though they could not say why. And in that feeling, Troy lived not as a city of stone, but as a presence in the land, as real as the wind, as deep as the roots of the oldest olive tree. Travelers passing through the region would sometimes stop at the hill out of curiosity, drawn by rumors or old maps that marked a great ruin near the strait. They would walk among the stones, pick up a shard of pottery, wonder who had held it last, and then move on, carrying only a vague sense of melancholy and the scent of time on their clothes. Few would leave offerings not out of piety, but out of respect, a coin, a flower, lock of hair tied with thread end. Though no god received them, the earth did, folding them into its layers like secrets whispered in the dark. And in those small gestures, there was a kind of continuity, a silent thread stretching from the past to the present, saying we remember even if we do not understand. Time did not erase, Troy it transformed it. The citadel became a shepherd's lookout. The temple courtyard became a sheep pen. The royal orchard became a wild grove where children gathered figs in summer. The great gates, long since rotted or carried away, left only faint depressions in the earth, visible only to those who knew where to look. And yet, in every transformation, something of the original remained, not in form, but in spirit, the sense of shelter, of community, of a place where people once gathered to share bread and stories and the warmth of a fire. And that spirit could not be plowed under or built over. It lived in the way the light fell on the hill at dusk, in the way the wind sighed through the ruins like a sigh of remembrance, in the way the stars seemed to watch over the place with a particular tenderness, as if they, too, had witnessed what had happened there and had not forgotten. No one marked the exact moment when Troy passed from memory into myth, from history into legend. It happened slowly, like ink fading on a page, like a name worn smooth on a tombstone. But even as the details blurred, the essence remained a city that had loved deeply, hoped fiercely, and fallen quietly, not with a roar, but with a breath. And that essence was carried forward not in textbooks or monuments, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the lullabies mothers sang without knowing their origin, in the way people still looked to the stars and wondered if those who came before were watching, if they were proud, if they were at peace. Centuries folded over the ruins, like layers of cloth over a sleeping body, gentle, protective, inevitable. Each generation added its own dust, its own stories, its own silence, until the hill was no longer just a place, but a palimpsest of lives, a tapestry woven from joy and grief, from fire and seed, from loss and renewal. And in that folding there was no judgment, no blame. No need for Troy to be remembered as either glorious or tragic. It was simply remembered as human, and that was enough. The gods of Olympus were long silent, their temples fallen, their names spoken only in poetry or jest. But the true gods of Troy, the hearth, the harvest, the river, the olive tree never left. They lived on in the daily rituals of those who farmed the land, who lit lamps at dusk, who poured a drop of wine on the earth before drinking, who whispered thanks to the sky after rain. And in those small acts of reverence, Troy endured not as a kingdom, but as a way of being in the world, attentive, grateful, connected to the cycles of life and death that turn without end. Even the wind changed over time, not in its direction, but in its voice. Where once it had carried the sound of lyres and laughter and the clang of the bronzesmith's hammer, it now carried the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wheat, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. And yet, if you stood very still on the hill at dawn, with your eyes closed and your breath slow, you could almost hear the echo of what had been not as a ghost, not as a haunting, but as a resonance, like the final note of a song that lingers in the air long after the singer has gone. And in that echo there was no sorrow, only peace, the peace of a story that has been told, a life that has been lived, a city that, for a time, shone brightly in the world, and then returned to the earth with grace. The hill grew quiet, yes, but not empty. It was full of memory, full of time, full of the quiet hum of existence, continuing. And in that quiet there was a kind of holiness, not the holiness of temples or priests, but the holiness of ordinary life returning, of seeds sprouting in ash, of hands planting what will feed the next generation, of voices telling stories that may not be true in every detail, but are true in spirit. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. Not to be remembered perfectly, but to be remembered lovingly, not as a lesson, but as a home. For Troy was never just a city of stone, and bronze it was a city of people, and people live on in the land they loved and the stories they told, in the quiet courage with which they faced both joy and ruin. And as long as someone walks the hill at dusk and feels the wind on their face and senses, just for a moment that they are not alone, Troy is not lost. It is simply waiting in the folds of time for dreamers to find it again. Even now, thousands of years after the last ember cooled on the hill by the sea, Troy lives not in stone or bronze, not in grand monuments or carved inscriptions, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible spaces of daily life. We still choose to open our doors to strangers, in the way we still offer bread and salt before asking a name, in the way we still believe, against all evidence and experience, that peace is not only possible, but worth striving for, even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. You may never have stood on the ruins of Hisarlik, may never have traced your fingers over the sun-warmed stones of its western ramparts, or felt the wind off the Dardanelles brush your skin like a memory from another life. But you have felt Troy in your own life in the moment you chose kindness over suspicion when someone new entered your circle. In the night you stayed awake worrying not for yourself but for someone you love, in the quiet courage it takes to keep hoping when everything around you seems to be falling apart. For Troy was never just a city built of mud brick and timber and high walls. It was a mirror, and in its story, in its fall, in its stubborn refusal to be forgotten, we see our own fragility, our own resilience, our own beautiful, heartbreaking humanity reflected back at us across the centuries, not as a lesson to be memorized, but as a whisper to be felt in the bones, a reminder that to be human is to build, to love, to lose, and to keep building again, even when you know the walls might not hold. The language you speak, the words you shape with your breath each day, carries echoes of that hill knot in obvious ways, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet lineage of stories that have traveled from mouth to ear to heart for generations, shaping how we understand loss, love, courage, and fate. When you say tragedy, you speak a word born from the Greek stage, yes, but rooted far deeper in the real, unpoetic grief of real people who watch their world burn not in a single night of fire and sword, but in the slow unraveling of trust, in the quiet collapse of everything they thought was solid. When you whisper home, you echo the longing of Aeneas as he carried his aging father. On his back through the smoke-choked streets, his small son clinging to his hand, his heart breaking with every step away from the only place he had ever known. When you speak of honor or hospitality or a promise kept, you are touching the very values that once held. Troy together in that, in the end, also helped bring it down, not because those values were wrong, but because they were human and therefore imperfect, vulnerable, open to interpretation, open to betrayal, open to the terrible weight of expectation. Language is memory made sound, and in every syllable you utter, in every story you tell. Troy breathes again, not as a ghost, but as a companion. A quiet presence in the rhythm of your speech, in the choices your words reveal about what you value, what you protect, what you are willing to lose. Love, too, carries its whisper, not the grand, sweeping love of poets and painters, not the love that launches 1,000 ships in legend, but the small, ordinary love that fills a lifetime. The love of a mother braiding her daughter's hair at dawn. The love of a potter shaping a bowl for his granddaughter's wedding. The love of two people choosing to stay together, not because it is easy, but because they have built something worth preserving, even when the world outside their walls is falling apart. Helen's story was never just about beauty or desire or the spark that lit a war. It was about the unbearable weight of being seen as a symbol instead of a person. Of having your choices, your pain, your complexity reduced to a single narrative written by others. And how many of us in our own quiet ways, in our own modern cities and digital lives, have felt that same loneliness. That same longing to be known not for our roles or our appearances or our achievements, but for the quiet truth of who we are when no one is watching. And in that ache, in that hope, in that quiet insistence on being seen, Troy lives not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of passion, but as a companion in the dark, a reminder that love, in all its forms, is both our greatest strength and our deepest vulnerability. And that to love at all is to risk loss, but also to touch something eternal. When you walk through a city at dusk and feel the weight of history in the stones beneath your feet, when you hear a lullaby that makes you think of your grandmother's voice, even though you can't remember the words, when you watch the stars and wonder if those who came before are watching back, if they are proud, if they are at peace, you are touching the same thread that connects us to Troy. It's not through blood or geography, but through the shared experience of being human in a world that is both beautiful and broken. It is not a thread of glory or conquest or divine favor, but of ordinary moments that never made it into the epics. A weaver humming a song as her shuttle moves back and forth, a child chasing a half-tame goat through a sunlit courtyard, an old man telling stories to wide-eyed grandchildren as fireflies drift through the air like fallen stars. These are the moments that build civilizations that outlast empires, that survive even fire and time and the relentless turning of the earth, because they are the true fabric of human life, not the battles, not the treaties, not the crowns, but the quiet acts of care, connection, and continuity that happen every day, in every age. In every place where people gather to share bread and stories and the warmth of a fire, you carry Troy with you in the stories you tell your children, not the polished versions from textbooks or movies, not the tales of heroes with perfect hair and gleaming armor who never doubt or falter, but the messy human stories of people who loved deeply and made mistakes, who faced impossible choices with no clear right answer, but did the best they could with the light they had and the time they were given. And in those stories, you pass on not just history, but humanity, the quiet understanding that to be human is to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, to reach for connection even when it might break your heart, and that there is no shame in that, only courage. And that, perhaps, is Troy's greatest legacy, not the wooden horse, not the 10-year siege, not the fall itself, but the love that made the fall matter, the lives that were lived fully within those walls. The ordinary dignity with which people faced both joy and ruin, and the quiet insistence that even in the darkest times, there is still room for kindness, for song, for hope. If you've ever stood on a shore and watched the waves roll in, feeling both small and part of something vast, you've felt what the people of Troy felt every day. The sea is both boundary and bridge, as both threat and lifeline, as the highway that brought traders with news and goods and sometimes, in the end, enemies with oaths and bronze. If you've ever looked at your city from a hill and felt a surge of pride mixed with fear for its future, you've stood where Priam stood, his white hair catching the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon not for glory, but for peace. If you've ever held someone's hand in the dark and whispered, "It will be okay," even when you weren't sure yourself, you've spoken with the voice of Hector, not as a warrior, but as a man who carried the weight of his people on his shoulders and still found time to lift his son onto them and call him Little King. We are not so different from them. We breathe the same air, dream the same dreams, love and lose in the same ways. And in that shared humanity, there is a kind of kinship that transcends time. A quiet understanding that we are all just passing through, trying to leave the world a little kinder than we found it. Troy whispers to us, not in thunder, not in visions or omens or voices from the sky, but in silence, in the pause between breaths. In the stillness before sleep, in the quiet moment when you close your eyes and let the noise of the day fall away, and all that remains is the soft hum of your own heart beating in the dark. It asks no grand questions, no demands for remembrance or repentance, only gentle, almost imperceptible ones that rise like mist from the earth. What will you build with your time? Who will you love, and how will you love them? What will you leave behind, not in stone or gold or fame, but in memory, in the hearts of those who knew you, in the small ripples your kindness sends out into the world? And there are no right answers, only the ones you live, the ones you choose with every breath, every word, every act of quiet courage, in a world that often rewards noise over stillness, speed over depth, spectacle over substance. Even in loss, there is continuity in the green shoots that push through the ash in the fields beyond the lower town. In the songs that traveled west with the survivors and were sung by firelight in foreign lands, in the way a single lullaby can cross oceans and centuries and still soothe a crying child in a room lit only by moonlight. Troy did not end in fire, it transformed as all things do, from city to story, from story to song, from song to silence, from silence back to dream. And in that transformation, it became something more enduring than stone. It became part of the collective memory of what it means to be human. To hope, to trust, to fall, and to rise again in the stories we tell. And in your dreams tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you may feel it. The warmth of a Trojan sun on your skin. The scent of time and baking bread on the wind. The soft murmur of voices, speaking a language you almost understand. Not with your ears, but with your bones, with your blood. With the deep, ancient part of you that knows you belong to a story much larger than yourself. For history is not a line of dates and battles and kings. It's not a straight path from past to present, but a river wide, slow, deep, carrying everything with it. Joy and grief, creation and destruction. Silence and songnand, we are all swimming in it, whether we know it or not, carrying fragments of the past in our hands. In our hearts, in our bones, not as burdens, but as gifts, as reminders that we are not alone, that others have walked this path before us, have felt this fear, this hope, this love, and have left behind not just ruins, but seeds. And Troy is one of those fragments, a shard of pottery painted with a bird in flight. A half-remembered melody hummed by a grandmother. A lesson in the cost of pride and the power of compassion learned not in a classroom, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. It does not demand that you remember its name, only that you remember what it means to be human, to care, to connect, to build something beautiful, even when you know it might not last. And so, as you listen to the sound of the waves in your mind, the same waves that once lapped at the shores below the citadel of Troy, that carried Paris to Sparta and Aeneas to a new world, that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless cities, and still keep turning, steady and eternal, know that you are part of this story too. Your presence here, your breath, your quiet attention in this moment, is a thread in the tapestry that began long before you drew your first breath and will continue long after your name has faded from memory. You do not need to do anything grand to honor Troy, to honor history, to honor the quiet courage of those who came before. You only need to live gently, to love deeply, to offer kindness when you can, to listen when others speak, and to rest well tonight, knowing that you, too, are part of the echo, part of the river, part of the endless, beautiful, heartbreaking story of being human. Let the stars above his Sarlacc shine down on you now, the same stars that watched over Priam and Hecuba as they sat in silence in their chamber. Over Hector as he walked the ramparts at dawn, over Andromache as she sang her son to sleep for the last time. Over the child who played in the courtyard and never knew it would be the last time they felt the sun on their face. Let their light remind you that you are not alone, that you are connected, not just to the people in your life today, but to everyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and wondered, hoped, dreamed, loved, and lost. And in that connection, in that vast, quiet web of shared humanity, there is peace. Not because the world is perfect, but because you are part of something that is, in its own imperfect, persistent way, whole. Troy is gone, but its whisper remains in language, in love, in the quiet courage of ordinary life, and it will keep whispering as long as someone is willing to listen, as long as someone is willing to dream, as long as someone chooses, in their own small way, to build a world where kindness matters more than conquest, where stories matter more than swords, where the quiet acts of care that never make it into the history books are still seen, still valued, still remembered. And that whisper is not behind you. It is all around you in the air you breathe, in the choices you make, in the love you give, in the dreams you carry into the night. So let yourself drift now into the soft, warm space between waking and sleep. Dies where time folds like a well-worn blanket, and the past is not a place behind you, but a presence all around you, holding you, whispering to you, reminding you that you belong. Let the echoes carry you, not backward into memory, but inward, to the quiet center of yourself, to the place where all stories end and begin, in the steady, gentle beat of your own heart, in the breath that rises and falls like the tide, in the knowledge that you are here, you are safe, and you are part of something ancient, something enduring, something beautiful. For you are here, you are listening, and that is enough. As we come to the end of our journey together tonight, let yourself rest here, in this quiet space between the past and the present. Between waking and dreaming, where the wind still carries the scent of time from the hills of Troy and the waves of the Aegean roll gently against the shore, as they have for thousands of years. You have walked softly through a world that once was, not as a stranger, but as a guest, and in your listening. In your presence even, as sleep gathered around you, you honored the lives that once filled those courtyards, those streets, those quiet moments of ordinary beauty that never made it into the songs, but mattered more than any battle ever could. Thank you for being here, for trusting this story with your attention, for letting it wrap around you like a warm blanket on a cool night. Your breath, your stillness, your willingness to listen without needing to remember every detail. That is the truest form of respect, not just for history, but for the humanity that flows through it and through you. And if this kind of storytelling brings you peace, if it helps you rest, if it makes the past feel close and kind, know that this space will always be here for you, like a lantern left burning on a quiet shore. Now, let the weight of the day fall away completely. Let your shoulders soften, your jaw unclench. Your thoughts drift like leaves on the surface of the Scamander River, carried gently towards still water. There is nothing more you need to do, nothing more you need to hold. Troy is at peace, and so can you be. Let the stars that once watched over Priam and Hecuba now watch over you. Let the same moon that lit the path for Aeneas as he fled the ruins now light your way into dreams. And may those dreams carry you not to fire or fear, but to olive groves at dawn, 2 courtyards full of laughter, 2 shores where the only sound is the sea breathing in and out, steady and eternal. This story ends, but not with finality, only with a soft closing, like a hand placed gently over a sleeping child's. The echoes of Troy will continue to whisper in language, in love, in the way we remember beauty and loss. And when you return, whether tomorrow or months from now, you'll find another story waiting, another world to walk through slowly, another invitation to rest deeply while history hums its lullaby in the background. So close your eyes now, if you haven't already, and let yourself drift. May your dreams walk the ancient shore. May your heart find peace in the rhythm of the waves. And may you wake tomorrow feeling a little more connected to the past, to yourself, to the quiet, enduring thread of humanity that binds us all. Sleep well, you are safe, and you are welcome here, always.